The year was long before Columbus, when Europe still burned women for witchcraft, and queens ruled only by the favor of kings. But across the ocean, on lands that would one day be called America, women already owned the fields, the homes, and the power. They chose their chiefs, and if those men failed, they could strip them of power with a single word. They governed through corn and council fire. They held veto over war. They were clan mothers, not consorts. So before we unearth their story, take a moment to like this video and subscribe. Not for luck, but to remember the women who ruled a continent before history forgot their names. Light your fire, settle in, and listen to the hidden queens of the First Nations. In asking what life was really like for women in Native American societies, the first lesson is that there is no single story. The continent held hundreds of nations, each shaped by place, language, economy, and ceremony. Still, certain patterns appear so often that they challenge old misconceptions. Across many regions, women owned houses and fields, traced descent through the mother's line, managed food systems that sustained communities, and exercised political authority through kinship and counsel. The details change from the longhouses of the northeast to the terraced fields and plazas of the southwest, to the lodges and teepees of the Great Plains, to cedar plank houses on the northwest coast, and to snow and sea ice in the Arctic. Yet the common thread is that women's labor and leadership were not private background, they were public foundations. Begin in the world of the Haudenosaunee, the confederated nations that Europeans called the Iroquois. Villages were built around longhouses where several matrilineal families lived under one roof. Children belonged to the mother's clan. Names, property, and responsibility passed through that line. Political life turned on this structure. Men served as chiefs in councils, but clan mothers nominated those chiefs, counseled them, and removed them if they failed the people. That removal power was not symbolic. It protected community order by ensuring that leadership matched the clan's welfare and character. Early observers noticed that women's agricultural labor also underwrote diplomacy. If a chief lost the confidence of the women who controlled stores of corn and clothing, his position was tenuous. In this society, women's authority was woven into kinship, economy, and law, and it endured through change because it lived in daily practice rather than a single event or title. Travel southwest to the Pueblos along the Rio Grande and the mesas of Arizona, and you find a different but related pattern. Among many Pueblo peoples, including Hopi and Laguna, society is organized around matrilineal clans. A husband often moved to the wife's home after marriage, and the oldest active woman in a Hopi clan could serve as an administrative leader who managed houses, gardens, and ritual paraphernalia. Spanish chroniclers of the 16th century remarked that women owned houses and fields, a striking contrast to Iberian norms. That contrast tells us the system predates colonization. In Pueblo towns, women's control of houses and garden plots anchored stability, while men rotated through ritual obligations and public offices. Female ownership of property did not remove men from leadership, but it located power inside the networks of mothers, sisters, and maternal aunts who safeguarded lineage, corn, and the objects that tied a clan to its ceremonies. Among the Diné, known in English as Navajo, creation narratives tie the origin of the clan system to changing woman. Descent through the mother ties each person to obligations and identity that flow from her line. Women's authority is visible in the economy as well as in story. Tradition credits Spider Woman with teaching weaving. From the 19th century onward, Navajo weaving moved through markets that rose and fell with livestock policies, railroads, and tourism. In many families, textile income buffered shocks to herds and land. The loom mapped a world in which technical skill, design, and social position combined to keep households fed and kin obligations intact. In this sense, weaving was not decorative craft. It was a knowledge system that converted grass, sheep, dye, and labor into security and respect. On the northern plains, Lakota women made mobility possible. A family could not move or remain without their work. Women processed bison, transformed hides into useful leather, prepared food for storage, and set up or struck the tipi with practiced speed. Long before glass beads became common through trade, they mastered quill work, a demanding art that required softening, dyeing, and flattening porcupine quills, then stitching them into precise designs that recorded identity and achievement. Stories identify a woman, white buffalo calf woman, as the messenger who brought the sacred pipe and teachings that shape the moral order. Through labor and law, women's work created the fabrics that warmed bodies and marked alliances, while women's teaching shaped the conduct that kept camp circles whole. In the southeast, Cherokee women cultivated cornfields, owned houses, and shaped diplomacy through kin ties. Husbands moved into the wife's household, and maternal uncles often taught boys the skills and values they needed. When the deerskin trade pushed men into long hunts and warfare, women kept fields, stored surplus, and maintained community life. During the 19th century, United States policies attempted to dismantle communal and matrilineal landholding by replacing it with individual allotments defined by patriarchal property law. Cherokee women saw clearly what would be lost. They petitioned and argued to defend matrilineal property and the food security it sustained. Their actions show that political influence did not sit only in councils. It also appeared in petitions and in the stubborn logic of a household economy controlled by women. Far to the northwest, the Tlingit of the coastal rainforest belonged to matrilineal clans and to one of two moieties. Names, crests, and the rights to fish traps, burying grounds, and territories pass through the mother's side. Women are central to the circulation of wealth in potlatch economies, where blankets, carvings, and copper shields move between houses to repay help and to affirm status. Chilkat weaving and spruce root basketry require years of learning and encode clan history in their patterns. In the colonial courts of the 20th century, clan women's testimony and the display of crest blankets served as evidence of land tenure and authority, because material culture preserved memory as law. In the Arctic, Inuit seamstresses engineer survival. A winter parka, whether caribou skin or later cloth, is a set of aerodynamic and hydrological choices. Stitch types must flex without leaking. Seams must shed water and frost. The Amauti, a woman's parka with a pouch for a baby, marries climate science to childcare. Researchers working with seamstresses in Nunavut and the Western Arctic describe how sewing knowledge travels through stories, apprenticeship, and local experimentation, and how women's clothing designs adapt to new materials while preserving performance requirements set by wind, ice, and travel. Sewing is not hobby work. It is technology that keeps families alive on sea, ice, and tundra. In the Great Lakes, Ojibwe women lead the seasonal harvest of manumin, or wild rice. Oral tradition remembers a migration to a place where food grows on water. During harvest, women organize canoes and light knocking sticks that bend the rice gently into the hull without breaking plants. Afterward, they lead drying, parching, and winnowing, so grain will keep through winter. The work is ceremony and economy. It is also governance, since women's collectives create and enforce rules that protect beds, set dates, and share labor. A bowl of manumin is therefore a record of women's authority over timing and technique, and of the way food systems encode law. These examples do not reduce to one model. They describe principles that recur in different places. Matrilineal descent did not erase men's authority, but it consistently gave women leverage over names, houses, fields, and political process. Food systems placed women at the center of survival and diplomacy. Artistic labor preserved law and memory. Spiritual narratives named women as origin givers and teachers whose gifts persist in ordinary tasks. To see native women clearly, we have to look where they placed power, in land, kinship, ceremony, and craft. From there, the history of North America looks less like a stage where women stood behind the actors, and more like a house where the builders set the beams and kept the fire. By the time dawn's first light crept across the meadow, the women of the village were already at work. Among them was Buffalo Bird Woman, her Hidatsa name, Wahine, who in the late 19th century witnessed both the endurance and the transformation of her people's agricultural life. Her story brings into sharp focus the quiet authority of women whose labor and knowledge made entire communities possible. She remembered how, in her youth, gardens stretched along the Knife River, their rows of corn, beans, squash, and sunflowers shimmering in the Montana sunlight. She recalled how the Hidatsa women planted with care, stored with precision, and traded with a far-flung network that reached distant camps. In the very soil, women held dominion. Across many eastern woodlands nations, the planting of the three sisters, corn, beans, and squash, was more than an efficient agricultural method. It carried spiritual significance, a metaphor for family, interdependence, and balance. When the hills held all three crops, the beans fed the corn with nitrogen, the corn provided a stalk for the beans, and the squash covered the ground to hold moisture and prevent weeds. This system had been honed over centuries. For many women, tending the fields also meant owning them. In some societies, the fields, tools, and harvest were their property. Their work was not invisible. It guided trade, diplomacy, and even conflict. Consider the step-by-step unfolding of a planting season in a matrilineal village of the Northeast. In early spring, women cleared the land. They used tools of stone or bone, and later iron, passed down through generations. They burned the remnants of last year's growth, then sowed corn kernels by hand, frequently reciting songs or prayers that asked for favorable rains and healthy growth. Next came beans and squash, inserted in hills spaced evenly across the field. As the summer sun climbed higher, the women staked the corn, trained the beans, weeded the squash vines, and in August harvested. The harvest brought laughter, chatter, and careful packing of dried corn, often stored in long racks for winter. Winter meant that women took the long beans, the dried squash, the stored corn, and parceled them out to the families, traded some for furs or pelts with visiting men, and negotiated supplies. Their role in food made them vital, the living hearth of the community. But gardening alone was not enough. In the plains, for example, the arrival of the horse and the expansion of bison hunts dramatically altered life. While men rode across the open grasslands pursuing herds, women moved with equal speed, striking tipis, packing household goods, processing hides, turning raw materials into durable equipment, and managing children and elders. In the words of one retrospective on plains, women's roles, the woman's place involved considerable labor. The men and the women were partners. He had his responsibilities, and she had hers, and both were necessary for their survival. One day, a girl child would watch her mother stretch out a hide, scrape it carefully, then dye and stitch it. The next day, she would help pack the travois, pulled by dogs or horses. Fields, craft, migration, they blended. In matrilineal clans, the political power of women flowed from this economic foundation. Among the nations of the Haudenosaunee, Iroquois, women not only controlled the fields and the harvest, but also the land and rights of use. Their decisions shaped the destiny of the whole nation. Women held councils, selected male chiefs or deposed them, and owned the longhouse. The teacher sky woman appears in legend as the matriarch who created the land, and this mythological origin reflected the visible fact that women provided life and nurture in everyday work. In such a society, A chief whose people faced discontent did not only face his male peers, the clan mother held him to account. The widespread European assumption that native men controlled everything and women only did domestic tasks was simply false. The women's spheres of labor, governance, and land ownership were one and the same. Transitioning into the world of the Southeast, we meet the figure of Nancy Ward, Nanyehi of the Cherokee. Born around 1738, she is an example of how a woman could combine traditional responsibilities with changing times. After demonstrating bravery in battle at Taliwa, she was given the title Beloved Woman, which allowed her to speak at councils and negotiate with European Americans. But Nancy Ward also remained deeply rooted in economic and familial foundations. Women in the Cherokee realm cultivated maize and maintained the food stores while men journeyed on the hunt. Her speech to the council in 1817 conveys the enduring logic of a female-centered economy. Don't part with any more of our lands, but continue on it and enlarge your farms and cultivate and raise corn. We, your mothers and sisters, will make clothing for you. The fact that she understood the intertwined nature of land, agriculture, and women's labor reveals how critical that labor was to community survival. That survival was tested in the era of European contact and colonization. For generations, the tribes had lived in balance with the land. Women, along with men, understood seasonal cycles, ceremonial rhythms, and kinship responsibilities. But the intrusion of European settlers brought not only new goods, but new assumptions about gender, about land tenure, about who held authority. Some colonial policies specifically sought to restructure indigenous households by giving land to individual men, introducing patriarchal property systems, or undermining the matrilineal system. For women, this meant that their previously secure foundation of clan, land, crop, craft, and kin came under pressure. A mother who had once passed her home to her daughter might now find that the title shifted to a male heir under U.S. law. A gardener who once traded corn for feathers now traded with men who believed women should be invisible. But the picture is not just one of loss. It's also a portrait of continuity and adaptation. Indigenous women did not disappear into history. They altered course. They brought European-introduced crops into their fields, adopted new tools, and used languages of treaty and negotiation to defend rights. Some women became translators or emissaries. Some kept weaving traditions, even as industrial looms arrived. They rebuilt households on new reservations and kept the memory of their ways alive through song, story, and seed saving. For example, women from tribal nations today walk across fields of corn revived from indigenous seed stock, knit together revival of foods and culture, and anchor movements of food sovereignty. The human texture of these lives is found in the everyday. A woman kneeling beside a drying rack of ears of corn, a child leaning into her mother's side while she weaves a bag of porcupine quills, a group of older women gathering in council to advise the next generation, a young woman watching a horse-mounted hunt return, then shifting her shawl and starting the task of preparing hides and the evening meal. Across dozens of nations, the pattern re-emerged. Women did not simply support the tribe, they sustained it. The fields, the homes, the kin networks, the craft, the harvest, and the trade were their domain. In turn, that domain became a site of authority, of negotiation, and of identity. As we move deeper into the story of what women did and how they lived, we will shift our focus to a single tribe and a single woman's day, weaving in how external pressures, warfare, disease, forced removal, intersected with their lived experience. But already the lessons are clear. To understand Native women's lives, we must look at the fields as much as the council house, the storage pit as much as the warrior's lodge, the long morning of corn planting as much as the afternoon ride of the hunting party. In those intertwining hours, women built worlds. As the sun rose high over the forest canopy, we turn now to the story of Weetamoo, the female sachem of the Pokasit Wampanoag in the mid-17th century. And through her story, we glimpse how a Native American woman navigated kinship, conflict, and colonial intrusion. Weetamoo was born around 1635 in what is now Rhode Island. Her father, a sachem of the Pokasit people, presided over diplomatic ties and trade with neighboring tribes and early European settlers. From her youth, Weetamoo learned both the traditions of her people and the demands of a world coming undone. In her lifetime, goods and people moved differently than they do now. In Pokasit territory, young women learned to gather shell and wampum, to process fish and corn, and to help organize alliances with other clans. Weetamoo acquired skills in diplomacy and leadership alongside domestic tasks. The later colonial record remembers her not merely for custom, but for action. She rode into council with reservation, formed alliances in war, and stood as a partner in treaty negotiations. She was as potent a prince as any round about her. One historian writes, re-evaluating what leadership could mean for a woman in her tribe. Her story brings into sharp relief the ways that indigenous women had a stake, not from the margins, but at the center of tribal life. In the Wampanoag world, women and men held distinct yet intertwined roles. While men might lead warriors into the woods and advise on war councils, women managed households, harvested stores, mediated kinship, and held symbolic as well as real authority. Scholars note that prior to intensive colonization, many tribes practiced gender relations that were complementary and egalitarian. Weetamoo's leadership came during a moment of intensifying pressure. The arrival of English colonists, their need for land, and their different views of property and gender created fault lines. Indigenous women's landholding, food economy, and clan power were less easily understood by European law and settlers. One study of indigenous women and property notes. Until recently, the idea that women could participate in society to the same degree as men was foreign to European settlers, but common in many native nations. Weetamoo understood how to walk both worlds. She knew the language of trade, of negotiation, of lineage, and she knew the tasks of women in her tribe, the clearing of the garden, the assignment of harvest, the weaving of bags and wampum belts that carried memory and treaty. One vivid scene. Weetamoo stands on a bluff overlooking the Mattapoisett River, watching trade canoes land. She inspects new strings of wampum, beads carved from shells so tightly bound they form narrative belts. These belts recorded gifts, pledges, births, deaths, a material archive of kinship. She carries them not just as ornament, but as authority. On the same day she watches men prepare for war, she gathers elder women and daughters to sort dried maize and barter hides. The linkage of these activities, harvest and diplomacy, makes clear that her realm was not divided into women's work and public work. It was woven. In 1675, when the conflict known as King Philip's War broke across New England, Weetamoo's leadership proved crucial. She allied with the Wampanoag leader Metacomet, King Philip, against English colonial encroachment. Her presence at tribal meetings, her knowledge of trading networks, her ability to marshal women's economic strength, all of this made her a key partner. She died in 1676 in its early stages, under tragic circumstances. Her death signals a turning point, not just for her people, but for women's political power in many tribes, as colonial structures and patriarchal norms grew stronger in indigenous policy. From this vantage, let us imagine a day in Weetamoo's life at the height of summer. The smoke-tongued hearth flickers at dawn. Women are already pounding corn into flour, chatting in low voices, their hands steady from years of rhythm and repetition. Weetamoo emerges from her dwelling, wrapped in a wampum-trimmed shawl, and greets young women bearing tobacco leaves and cedar bark baskets. They kneel to present harvested clams and shell beads. She nods. Her voice is measured, her gaze mindful. A messenger arrives from the English settlement, seeking trade terms. The men of the tribe gather in a separate lodge, but Weetamoo invites her own council of sisters and daughters to review the treaty. They study lines carved into birch bark, who receives land, who receives wampum, which clans keep access to the river. Under her watch, women speak with men, decisions flow through her. Later, as shadow moves toward noon, she mounts a pony and rides to the meeting place by the estuary. Here, English and native leaders sit under a large elm tree. Some men show flat maps drawn in colonial ink. Others present deer skins and muskets. Weetamoo listens, touches the belts, and speaks for her clan's right to harvest in the salt marsh and fish in the river. Her voice rings clear, and the English scribes stiffen. She understands the power of the cornfields behind her. If her people's access to seed is cut, the clan dissolves. If the river access is lost, the women who collect shellfish lose their livelihood. The English may think this is the men's talk, but she knows that women are the keepers of supply and lineage, and thus keepers of sovereignty. In the late afternoon she returns and joins the women in preparing hides. The light wanes, and within the longhouse, younger girls learn to sew porcupine quills into ceremonial belts, while older women teach seed-saving and drying techniques for squash. Weetamoo stands nearby, asking about the ebbing of berries, instructing that the harvest be gathered early in 2 weeks because the stream's flows are warming. She remembers how European-introduced diseases 2 decades earlier devastated her people, and she watches carefully as a young woman coughs. She knows the older women must pray, and the medicine bundle must be opened. Disease, she understands, is as much a threat as rifle or treaty. That evening, in the council fire, we hear voices. She does not sit silently while men speak of war. She asks, what will happen if food stores fail this winter? She reminds the gathering that the harvest depends on mothers and sisters, that the longhouse stands only if the garden does, that diplomacy rests on food, kinship, and continuing renewal. She offers a belt of wampum to the allied tribe as they agree to patrol the land together. Then the drum and song begin, and the women rise with rattles and voices, weaving ritual into governance. Her life suggests something important. The public role of women in Native American societies can only be fully appreciated when we see that economic production, family drawn through the mother's line, and territorial rights were not separate spheres, they were one. When colonization pushed patriarchal notions into those structures, the breadth of women's power narrowed. Yet even as change erupted, women like Weetamoo show how indigenous authority was alive, relational, and sustained by work, wisdom, and kin. As the night deepens, she returns to the hearth. Children sleep in the longhouse corners. The fire's flames cast warm orange onto quill-stitched robes hanging on the wall. Weetamoo reflects on the day's negotiation, the summer's harvest, the river's ebbing fish, and tomorrow's possible war. Unnoticed by many of the men who watch the woods, the longhouses stand because the women built them. The treaties shift because women made the cords, stored the corn, and held the names of the people. Through her story, we begin to ask different questions. Not only what did women do, but how did women shape worlds? By mid-morning, in a village nestled between river and woodland, the hum of women's work rises like a steady wind through every lodge, field, and garden. It is easy to underestimate how integral women's tasks were to both survival and spirit. Take, for instance, the women of the plains. While bison, hunts, and dramatic cavalry charged the imagination, women gathered roots, herbs, grasses, and berries with intimate knowledge of the land's seasonality and medicinal promise. The author of one account writes, "In many Plains Indian tribes, the women had complete control of the food supply, and their status in the community depended to some extent on the manner in which women distributed their reserve of provisions. These supplies, dried meats, gathered plants, preserved berries, were not just backstage, but central to diplomacy, mobility, and survival." One to fetch fresh water from the creek, one to carry the chopping block and knives. She speaks quietly of the camp's schedule. "By noon, we strike the lodge and follow the buffalo trail tomorrow. Finish tanning the hides tonight. The eldest girl shall practice quill plaiting while the sun is low." Her voice carries expectation mixed with affection. Meanwhile, across the river valley, women of a matrilineal woodland society convene in the Council of Mothers. In this society, women own the homes, the fields, and household goods. They select the chiefs, they oversee stores of dried corn and clothing. According to historians, they usually owned the family's housing and household goods, engaged in agricultural food production and gathering of foodstuffs, and reared the children. In the council, the clan mother speaks. "The river flooded last spring later than memory. The beans in the north field are late. We must arrange for additional store and consider the treaty with the neighboring nation." She looks not to men for this task, but to her fellow women, whose knowledge of the land, when to plant, when to harvest, when to barter, gives them authority. Their ceremony carries weight. In the southwest Pueblo country, the stair-stepped houses reflect cliffs and horizon alike. Women tend gardens perched on mesa tops, plant corn and squash under the desert sun, weave blankets, prepare clay vessels, and maintain the ritual tools of the kivas. Gendered tasks exist, yes, men hunt and serve ritual roles, yet the reality remains that women's labor kept crops alive and ritual grounded. Art teacher resources describe, "Men were responsible for hunting, warfare, and ceremony, while women were responsible for childcare and the preparation of food and clothing." That description risks simplicity if taken alone, because women also had responsibility for ritual preparation of food, storage, and often played roles as healers or spiritual advisors. Indeed, the lines of public and private blur. Spirituality is one of the clearest lenses through which women's significance emerges. In many indigenous traditions, women are connected with life-giving, seed-keeping, water-keeping, and the knowledge of plants and medicines. For the Plains women, daily prayers for family and food were routine. The women's knowledge of the vast array of wild plants, used for food and for various purposes such as pipe smoking, dyes, incense, or medicines, was part of their realm. Among the Haudenosaunee Iroquois women, the connections between land, kin, and seeds hold generational consequence. One article noted that indigenous women, as life-givers, have the responsibility to care for the well-being of all life, including children, the seeds for our foods, and the waters. The woman who opens the lodge in the morning, stirs the fire, checks the beadwork, carries saplings to the hearth. That woman does not just maintain the house, she is ensuring law, memory, and community continuity. Yet the work is not always visible in traditional historical narration. Indigenous women faced both the mundane and the momentous. They buried their dead, they cared for the sick, they wove story into porcupine quills and blankets, they carried baskets of dried corn to the trading canoe. In the southeast, marriage and kinship customs often placed a woman's brother in the teaching role for her sons, rather than the father, a system which centered women's clan as the anchor of lineage. A study of southeastern nations notes that Marriage practices enabled females to interact with males in ceremonies that linked them to their society, and that women's labor in agriculture and child-rearing allowed the home to affect the domain of the town or village. One morning, the sister aunt gathers the boys and tells them, "Your mother's clan holds the name, holds the land. The chief's son shall follow his mother's line." She hands around a corn cob, explains the three sisters' pattern once more, and reminds them that they owe to the corn, the beans, and the squash as much as to the hunt. The challenge of change came after contact with Europeans. A woman in the longhouse heard rumors of treaty terms and land allotments. She sensed the shifting ground below her feet. The assumption that men should hold property undid women's ownership of houses and fields. The disruption of clan systems, the introduction of patriarchal norms, and the legal erasure of matrilineal title challenged the older order. Historians describe that pre-colonization, many native societies were matrilineal. Those tribes with patrilineal organization were generally more egalitarian than in colonizing European societies. So a woman who once owned the lodge, controlled the food stores, chose the chiefs, now faced an alien legal system that did not recognize her rights. Yet she did not vanish from history. Instead, adaptation began. Consider Hummingbird Feather, fictional composite, from a tribal village forced onto a reservation. She rises early to carry water from the well, while remembering how once she had carried it from the river free of fences. She plants corn in borrowed soil. She attends classes where they teach English and new farming. At evenings, she still teaches her daughter to shell beans and seed corn, reminding, "This seed remembers the time before the fences." Her voice echoes older wisdom, even as the world shifts around her. And when the federal agent comes to register property, she waits while her brother signs the paper, her mother shaking her head. We remember the woman who held the stove, the seed bed, the name. Do you? The fields may change, the laws may alter, but the woman's memory holds the line. In the glow of dusk, the women of the village meet around the fire. They share stories of the day, hides tanned, corn shelled, medicine plants dried. Among them is the elder who learned porcupine quill plaiting, the middle-aged mother who keeps the store of cloth and beads, and the young apprentice who has just woven her first bag. They speak of the world in which women walked both physical and spiritual paths, of a ceremony next week in which the women will carry offerings of corn and tobacco for the planting ritual. The youngest leans forward listening to her grandmother say, "When you plant the corn, you also plant the future of your people." The hands that plant hold the power of tomorrow. A hush falls. The fire crackles. This is more than folklore. This is living continuity. What does this mean for someone reading centuries later? It means that women's authority was embedded in daily tasks, in seed storage, in kinship naming, and in ceremony. It means that the conventional idea of indigenous women being subordinate is inaccurate. Instead, women held layered roles: economic, political, spiritual, familial, and in many societies they were linchpins rather than sidebars. Yet because colonial narratives often erased or devalued that authority, the image has rarely been fully recovered. It also means that when we talk about the arrival of colonists, the focus cannot only be on men's treaties and wars. We must ask, what happened to the women who tilled the land, selected the chiefs, sewed the skins, and raised the children? The morning mist still clung to the treetops when Sister Cedar, a composite figure drawn from many native women's experiences, awakened in her new home on the reservation. The land felt different, less the garden she once knew, less the well-tended field beside the river, more a compact plot defined by white men's surveys and fence lines. Sister Cedar's grandmother had once walked freely to the creek, tossed open a basket of fresh ears of corn, and greeted the clan mother with a smile. Now, Sister Cedar stood at the edge of a small fenced allotment of 40 acres, marked by a survey stake reading Lot 12, Tract B, Indian Reservation. The shift from communal land to individual allotment had altered the rhythm of her life, as well as the logic of her identity. In the early 19th century, many indigenous nations still held land collectively, often administered through clan or tribal-based systems. But with the advance of U.S. government policy, particularly after the passage of the Indian Removal Act of 1830, a dorsal wave of resettlement and legal restructuring began to reshape patterns of ownership, kinship, and governance. Women who had once stood as clan mothers and land custodians found themselves negotiating tiny parcels, opening bank accounts, or witnessing the sale of land portions by men whom they did not know as family. The communal garden, the longhouse, the maternal clan's storehouse of seed, all were under quiet pressure. A historian notes, historically, Native American women exercised rights and responsibilities of great importance in their tribes. It was only with the coming of white settlers to America's shores that the traditional ways of Indian life slowly crumbled under European domination. Let us imagine Sister Cedar's day. At dawn, she draws water from the well drilled by the government project, while remembering how her aunt once fetched water from the riverbank, singing the seasonal invocation to the Turtle Clan. She steps into her half-acre garden, planted by her own hand, but surrounded now by uniform rows of wagon-rutted ground. Her maize grows, yes, but the soil is thinner, the rain less reliable, and the cost of seed has replaced the gift of kin-shared jars. Her hands have learned new patterns: fill out the allotment map, keep the contractor's record, pay the annual fee to the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Meanwhile, across the driveway, the women's longhouse, once a place of communal weaving and counsel, is shuttered. The young women learn English at the boarding school. The mothers sew shuttle and loom less often because factory cloth is arriving. In this shifting terrain, women held on. Across tribes, there were voices of resistance and adaptation. In 1817, among the Cherokee Nation, 2,500 Cherokee women submitted a petition, led by Jenny McIntosh, opposing land cessions. She was the first signer of the Cherokee Women's Petition of May 2, 1817, and later authored one of the first women-led rights petitions in U.S. history. Her act reminds us, women did not vanish. They engaged new political forms, grappling with treaty law, colonial courts, and public petitions, while also holding their families and fields together. At the same time, in the lands of the Chickasaw Nation in Mississippi, Betsy Love Allen owned her farmland, her cattle, and her estate. Under Chickasaw law, she was effectively a femme sole, a married woman, whose property did not pass automatically to her husband. Her case in the 1830s helped lay precedent for married women's property rights in the United States. These were not anomalies. They were continuations of indigenous women's long-standing property, kinship, and political systems, even in the face of rewriting. But the pressure was relentless. On the reservation, the tempo quickened. Children boarded at distant schools. Elders watched the removal of sacred trees, and women transported baskets of tools and seed across unfamiliar terrain to a government farm. Sister Cedar meets her friend White Willow under the half-finished community house. They share tea made from dandelion root, talk of a policy meeting. Next week, the BIA supervisor will decide how the new irrigation will work and whose water rights count. White Willow says, "They keep saying we must become farmers like the white men. They do not ask how we gathered, how we stored, how we told the stories of our seeds." She remembers her grandmother's corn storage bins lined with woven mats, each clan's name carved into the beam. Sister Cedar feels an ache of continuity. The transformation was deeply personal. Federal government policies weren't just about land and farming. They touched bodies. Women's reproductive autonomy was targeted by colonial logics of control. As one researcher frames it, federal policies regarding Native women's reproductive decisions were carried out unevenly, but hinged largely on local conditions and Native response and engagement. Sister Cedar learns of the sterilization of a neighbor decades earlier, of the hidden paperwork that says a young mother's tubal ligation are consented by a state hospital while she recovered from childbirth. The disruption is generational. Grandmothers told children of the ways to plant, but now daughters ask if the seed can be insured and if they can keep their income separate. The cultural memory shakes. Yet in the dim light of evening, the women meet. Sister Cedar opens her ledger, small, worn. She records not only corn yields, but the names of the women who planted, the seed they saved, and the women who gathered at the riverbank last autumn. She inscribes a list of forgotten herbal medicines so she might pass it to her niece. The council of women gather around a low fire. There is talk of revival. The women plan a seed swap with another tribe, build a mural of the ancestors, restore the weaving loom in the longhouse. White Willow shows sketches of a new garden plot, designed like the Three Sisters Hill. Corn, beans, squash, interplanted in a circle, even though the land around them is rectangular survey lots. They are combining old logic and new form. The story of women in this era is one of continuity and rupture. Their roles remained rooted in land, kinship, seed, craft, and ceremony, but the frameworks around them were shifting fast. Removal forced relocation, allotment redefined land rights, boarding schools eroded language and kin networks. Federal law altered citizenship and voting rights, and yet women carried on. They taught daughters to plant, wove blankets from sheep introduced by the agents, argued in courtrooms, petitioned legislatures, and preserved their seed and stories. One study of indigenous women and property asserts that Western legal systems failed to grasp the complex and unique tribal societies they encountered. Sister Cedar walks to the ridge overlooking the reservation as dusk deepens. She sees the old boundary of the forest her grandmother named, despite the newer road and fence. She recalls the teaching, "When I plant the corn, I plant hope for the children." She looks at the staked lots, the dusty tractors, the modern silo, and the old drying rack side by side. The camera of time moves backward and forward. She carries both worlds in her hands. Her story signals a critical question. What happens to a woman who has always owned the field, the seed, the loom, when the title shifts to a patriline, or when the land is sold under a dam project? It signals, how does a society preserve its logic when the map changes? The answer lies in the small acts, the women who keep the garden, who teach the child, who record the seed, who petition the government, who raise the fire circle and weave the memory into cloth. When we look deeply at life in this era, we see not just disruption, we see persistence. In the thick quiet of dawn on the reservation, light touches the dew-bright grass, and a woman named Rising Sun, a composite figure representing many real lives, steps out to her work, repairing a broken loom, gathering wild onions, and recalling the voice of her grandmother teaching seeds. Rising Sun belongs to a generation born when the world her grandmother knew already felt fractured. She remembers being taken at age 8 to a distant boarding school, separated from her mother, her family, her clan. The classroom walls were sterile, her hair was cut, her name was changed. In that place, the woman who should have taught her the loom instead was no longer present, replaced by strangers who dismissed her language, her dress, her ceremony. This was the legacy of the boarding school era, and it shaped women's lives in ways both visible and hidden. Historians record that from 1819 to 1969, the U.S. ran or supported hundreds of boarding schools aimed at assimilating indigenous children, denying their languages and faith and displacing them from their homes. Rising Sun's mother, Corn Lady, once owned the drying racks of beans and squash that her mother had built. But now Corn Lady's land was reduced, her seed store under watch. Her husband had to sign forms for the Bureau of Indian Affairs. The older generation had taught ceremony, clan recitation, harvest rhythm. The middle generation had boarding schools in their histories and allotment forms in their hands. Rising Sun now navigated new spaces, college applications, tribal government meetings, and seed revival projects. Her day begins with a cup of tea brewed from sage and sweetgrass, plants she learned to collect at dawn as a child. She chats with the other women in her house about the upcoming seed swap, the loom restoration, and the tribal council meeting where she will speak about wild rice beds. In the local tribal schoolroom, the teacher asks, "Who planted the three sisters this spring?" A hand raises. Rising Sun stands and recounts how her grandmother planted corn, beans, squash, how her aunt dried the corn, using the clan's drying racks, how the seed was passed through the mother's line. She explains how the land surveys disrupted the garden hills, how the garden is now square and measured. In her voice lies both memory and petition. We still plant, we still harvest, we still carry our seeds. The children listen. In the month ahead, Rising Sun will lead a field trip to the river to collect cattail roots and wild rice. She will teach about the ceremony that preceded the harvest, the song that once opened the field, the elder who stored the waterweed baskets. Her work is rooted in continuity and reform. In the afternoon, Rising Sun walks to the tribal office. She sits among other women, elders with softened hands, young mothers with infants in wrap carriers, consultants from the university, discussing the creation of a women's council to oversee land use, seed sovereignty, and cultural programming. At the head of the table sits a woman named Sky Bear, herself a survivor of a boarding school. Sky Bear speaks. "We were told to forget our language, our songs, our ways, but we remember, we have our memory, and that is our power." The women around the table nod. They know that across tribal nations, indigenous women are reassuming roles of leadership long suppressed or devalued. According to one overview, the influence of indigenous women on modern democracy and rights echoes the old matrilineal systems of the Haudenosaunee and others. As evening nears, the fire in the longhouse is lit. Rising Sun's daughter watches from the bench while the women raise baskets of dried corn, porcupine quill belts, and paintings capturing the harvest. There is a ceremony. The women will sing the seed song, the seed remembers song that the aunt taught her mother. Rising Sun takes the drum, the low beat pulsing through the longhouse. It does not replicate the warrior's drum of the hunt. It is the drum of planting and preservation. The women speak their intentions, to plant resilience, to teach the children, to recover language, to reclaim land. Many of them once believed the colonial world had erased them. Now they rebuild with care. But the story is not one of seamless revival. There are grief and loss embedded in every stitch and seed. Boarding school survivors recount the trauma, the cutting of hair, the suppression of language, the forbidding of ceremony, the emotional and physical abuse. Rising Sun remembers her classmates' silence, the teacher's scolding written in ledger books, the barred doorway when she tried to say a word in her language. Those memories live. They ripple into her daughter's life in less obvious ways. A grandmother's reluctance to speak the clan stories, a hesitation to sing the harvest song in public, an unspoken question of what will happen to our seed line now. But they also seed strength, because the women now hold meetings, craft policy, teach their daughters to weave and sew and speak. One night, Rising Sun dreams. She stands on the terrace of a mesa, the sun low. In her hand is a stalk of corn planted by her grandmother, the tassels silver lit. Around her stands generations of women, the grandmother, the aunt, the mother, the daughter. Each holds a tool, basket, spindle, seed sack, ledger. They are weaving a blanket of time, passing from hand to hand. The surface bears words in the cloth. We plant, we speak, we remember. In that dream, the land is both the same and changed, but the work continues. The next morning she rises and finds her daughter untying a sack of seed under the porch. The daughter looks at her mother and asks, "Will I plant this?" Rising Sun smiles and says yes. She knows that planting is more than putting seed in soil. It is planting identity, community, future. The girl takes the sack and the mother watches. The cycle turns. Across the nation, indigenous women are asserting influence in tribal governance, food systems, environmental stewardship, and education. They are guided by both ancestral logic and modern law. For example, the indigenous women's movement in agriculture emphasizes food sovereignty, controlling the seeds, the land, the methods of growing. Women who once stored corn in communal racks now organize seed networks and preserve heirloom varieties. Scholars note that current gender roles in native communities remain strongly affected by the history of oppression, but also strongly shaped by resurgence and resistance. We must ask, what does this mean for the reader? It means that native women's lives were not left in the past. They continue. The corridor from grandmother to granddaughter is not broken simply by policy or war or boarding school. It bends, curves, but persists. Rising Sun's story shows that the same hands that once planted beans on buffalo hide mats now type reports in tribal offices and press conference rooms. The same women who sewed porcupine quills now design murals that tell the story of their people. The same voices that led harvesting ceremonies now brief state environmental commissions. The continuity is real. At the Longhouse fire, Rising Sun turns to the older woman, Aunt Medicine, and says, "We still have much to reclaim, but we also have much we have regained." Aunt Medicine nods. "Yes," she says, "we kept the seed, we survived the school, we saw the maps change, but here we are." And with that, the women sing again, the drum heavy, the rattles soft, their voices rising to the rafters of the Longhouse. In the broad sweep of the 21st century, indigenous women are reshaping the definition of leadership, blending ancient roles of seed keeper, kin mother, healer, and craft worker with roles as environmental scientist, tribal executive, policy strategist, and global advocate. Let us follow the story of a woman we will call Rising Dawn, whose day begins at dawn in the tribal capital. She is the newly appointed head of her nation's Department of Natural Resources and Food Sovereignty. Her grandmother once planted the fields that fed the village. Now she oversees land use agreements, seed banks, carbon capture projects, and tribal enterprises in sustainable agriculture. She stands on a balcony overlooking the still green hills that were once planted by women of her clan. In her thoughts, she hears their voices, "Tend the soil, tend the people." Rising Dawn's schedule swirls around meetings with her team of agronomists and elders, conferences with state agencies, and workshops for young women learning traditional weaving and food ways. At one meeting, she opens with the words, "Our women have always been the keepers of life, the cornfields, the baskets, the seeds, the future." She presents a map showing restored wild rice beds, interplanted squash and beans, and traditional burying grounds that had been closed for decades. She describes how the tribe is launching a Three Sisters garden project in the city, engaging urban indigenous youth and teaching them to plant, harvest, preserve, and pass on seed. The project roots back to the eastern woodlands fields of the Three Sisters. The women of the tribe lead, the men support. The land recalls its ancient rhythm. At noon, she proceeds to a board meeting of the tribal enterprise. The enterprise invests revenue from gaming and renewable energy into a seed bank, a women's artisan cooperative, and a small processing plant for squash, corn, and beans. Rising Dawn listens as the financial report is presented. She asks, how many women shareholders? How many acres are dedicated to heirloom seed? Are we measuring cultural return as well as economic return? Under her watch, the enterprise begins, including metrics such as number of women trained in seed saving, number of elders teaching workshops, number of traditional ceremonies restored. This is not philanthropy. This is governance built on values rooted in indigenous women's economic and kinship foundations. Research reminds us that indigenous women's role in tribal governance is increasing. Some women obtained positions on tribal councils and tribal courts, and women across the United States are now asserting modern political leadership in their nations. Late afternoon brings a field visit. Rising dawn walks beside the river, where cattail roots and wild rice once formed the staple harvests of women's work in her culture. She kneels beside an elder woman, and they scatter harvested grain into drying baskets. The elder speaks of the medicine of the seed, of how women long ago stored grain within clan houses, and how seed carried memory of ancestors and seasons. Rising Dawn reflects on how her grandmother's cedar-shingled drying racks have been replaced by modern solar-heated structures. But the logic remains the same. Women tend the food, tend the people, tend the land. A recent policy brief argues that Indigenous women are crucial actors in environmental justice and cultural preservation. Evening arrives, and Rising Dawn gathers with the Women's Council, elders, mothers, daughters, and apprentices. They open with a pipe ceremony and then gather in a circle. The young women speak of urban projects, of sustainability internships, of learning to code seed database software. The elders speak of porcupine quill work, cedar bark baskets, and the night when the moon guided the planting of squash. One young woman rises and says, "I'm restarting our grandmother's weaving circle, and the cloth will sell in the marketplace, but the design will tell our seed line story." Another says, "I'm asking the tribal council to allocate 5 acres for medicinal plant restoration run by women." The grandmother responds, "You carry the future. We carried the seed." In the silent pause that follows, Rising Dawn remembers the boarding school era, the loss of language, the seizure of children, the break in the chain of women teaching women. She thinks of her own mother, who had to attend a school far from home, who learned English and not her ancestral tongue, and who later returned and struggled to revive the domestic tasks of garden and loom. That memory gives urgency to the work. When the tribe drafts its new constitution later this month, Rising Dawn will argue for statutory recognition of women's clan roles, seed sovereignty rights, and women's land stewardship in the new law. She believes that the matrilineal foundations of her culture must be statutory, not just ceremonial. Scholars have argued that legal protections for Indigenous women remain incomplete. While legislation such as the Savannahs Act and Not Invisible Act exist to address missing and murdered Indigenous women, they do not yet fully guarantee women's rights or tribe-based enforcement. Late at night, she sits at her desk, half lit by a single lamp. She reviews the archival minutes from 1900, when women petitioned land allotment laws. She reviews the seed inventory forms and drafts a new curriculum for summer youth, connecting girls to gardening, women to enterprise, elders to mentorship. She sketches a design of a mural for the longhouse that depicts 4 women, the grandmother planting maize, the mother weaving cloth, the daughter speaking at the council, the granddaughter studying seed science. She writes the phrase, "Women hold the seed, the story, the future," at the foot. She closes her eyes and hears the lullaby her mother sang in her language as they sat by the corn crib. "May your roots go deep. May your arms reach towards sky." She whispers it now to her own daughter asleep in the next room. We see how Indigenous women carry forward a legacy of labor, leadership, ceremony, and survival into a modern world defined by climate change, migration, legal complexity, and global activism. Women like Rising Dawn show that the fields and craft rooms of their ancestors are not relics. They are foundations upon which new governance, new economies, and new identities are built. The interplay of tradition and innovation, seed banks and boardrooms, porcupine quills and policy papers, clan mothers and women's councils is real and vibrant. What does this mean for the future of indigenous communities? It means the logic of matrilineal descent, of women as custodians of land and seed, of craft and kin, is not only historic, but foundational for contemporary resurgence. It means that when a tribe negotiates a mining lease, or passes a climate plan, or files a lawsuit over water rights, women are in the room, shaping from the ground up. It means that harvesting wild rice, drying corn, sewing beadwork, and talking in the council are all part of one continuum. In the quiet of dawn, a hush falls over the ancestral garden. The rows of corn gleam with dew, the beans climb their trellises, and the squash leaves lie heavy and curled. Standing among them is Morning Star, a composite figure echoing many real lives. The granddaughter of the women who built the fields, stored the seeds, and held council by hearthlight. In her hand, she holds a small packet of heirloom maize, the seed her grandmother saved, the same line dating back through generations of women keepers. She breathes in the cool air and knows she is part of something far larger than herself. Morning Star's schedule begins in the seed shed beneath the women's longhouse. She opens the wooden door, smooth with age, and sees jars of dried corn, proper labeling by clan and year, shawls embroidered with the names of seed keepers and photographic records of past harvests. Her task: compile the seed inventory, verify the viability, plan the next planting cycle, and, just as crucial, teach the young apprentices who will take her place. She smiles as a girl of 10 enters carrying a basket of squash blossoms, bright yellow in the pre-dawn light. "Here," Morning Star says, "this seed remembers your grandmother, your aunt, your mother. When you plant it, you carry their hands into the soil." The girl nods, reverent. And this is no metaphor. Scientists now recognize that seed saving among indigenous women is more than tradition. It is biodiversity, climate resilience, cultural architecture. The seed is a genome, a story, a responsibility. Later that morning, she attends a tribal food sovereignty workshop, where women elders, scientists, youth and policymakers gather around rectangular tables in a newly built cultural center. They discuss the 6 pillars of indigenous food sovereignty: land access, cultural methods, decision-making, ecological knowledge, seed rematriation, and community economies. The language is modern, the setting air-conditioned, but the logic echoes the matrilineal villages of old. Women own the fields, women speak for the seed, women build the storehouse of the future. At one table, an elder recounts the story of her grandmother, who traveled with her clan to harvest wild rice in canoes at dawn, knocking stalks gently into the hull, sorting, drying, storing in clan house bins, long before commodification altered the rhythms. The young women listen, take notes, ask questions. Later, the group drafts a charter. "We declare that we hold sovereignty over our food systems. No longer will our ancestral gardens be fenced off, our seed banks sold, our knowledge ignored." It is activism rooted in memory and forward-looking strategy. In the afternoon, Morning Star walks to the river where the clans once gathered cattail roots, fish and wild rice. She joins a group of women and 2 spirits who wade into shallows, gather rushes, and talk of treaty rights, climate change, and the legacy of boarding school trauma. The conversation is candid. They discuss how, in the early 20th century, girls were taken away to distant schools, language suppressed, rituals banned, and how that rupture still echoes in the hush of elders who seldom speak of what they endured. But they also speak of resilience, of gardens revived by grandmothers, of seed lines returned by tribes, of young women and 2 spirits now taught to harvest, butcher, weave, petition, legislate. The past is not erased, it is repurposed. As dusk falls, the women gather in the council fire circle of the longhouse. The fire flickers, faces glow, drums begin softly. Morning Star stands, addresses the circle. My grandmother stood where I stand. She stored corn, she wove cloth, she spoke in council. I will plant, I will weave, I will speak for her and for my daughter. She holds aloft the packet of heirloom maize. The drumbeat quickens, the rattles come, the song begins. That night under stars, Morning Star reflects on the continuum. The clan mothers of old, who nominated chiefs, selected seed, stored corn. The removal era when land was surveyed and women's rights were undermined. The boarding school era when children were taken and language shuttered. The late 20th century revival when seed banks reopened and women returned to councils. And now the 21st century moment where indigenous women stand as governors, scientists, entrepreneurs, activists. Their story is not just survival. It is transformation. It is legacy made alive. As you, the reader, close the book, you might ask, why does this matter? It matters because when we view Native American women only as victims of history, we miss the full truth. We miss the fields they planted, the councils they held, the seeds they saved, the laws they shaped. We miss how their labor, craft, and governance shaped nations. We miss how their continuity links past and future. In the case of Morning Star and the women like her, we also glimpse hope. A hope rooted in land, seed, kin, craft, and counsel. A hope that the sowing of corn today is also a sowing of sovereignty tomorrow. A hope that when a woman tends the garden, that garden carries name, identity, survival, community. A hope that when a daughter learns to stitch porcupine quills or to plant beans with corn, she learns that she is both descendant and ancestor. So this is the story of what life was really like for women in Native American tribes. It is a story rooted in real tasks, planting corn, harvesting rice, weaving baskets, sitting in council, but also in real decisions, selecting chiefs, storing seed, petitioning governments. It is a story of loss and reclamation, of ruptures and regeneration, of the public and the private converging.